Module 3, Services. Promises are closely connected with our understanding of services. After all, we build services on the basis of keeping promises. And we've already seen that common knowledge is basically a way of standardizing a service when disseminating facts. The generalization of our fact example to any other kind of promise is how we extend that story to reach services of any kind. This power to generalize similar things is the essence of promise theory. We can see how seemingly different issues are related when we see a common pattern. I hope it's starting to be clear by now from the basics of offer, plus, and acceptance or minus promises, and from the principle of autonomy of agents, that services can't just be one-way processes. Nothing can only be one way as long as agents decide for themselves, because everything is about the independent consent of autonomous agents. Now that we've covered the basics already, there's a few different patterns and approaches to consider, different protocols, if you like, for who goes first, when agents will offer things, and when they will accept each other's promises. To model a service, we start, as always in promise theory, with promises. A plus or offer promise from a service provider, and a minus or acceptance promise from a service client. Nothing happens without both of these to form a binding. There are two different roles, no longer sender and receiver, but rather provider and client. It's a subtle semantic distinction, but that tells us something too. Service is really just communication disguised. In this simple diagram, we don't say much about the interaction. We don't need to. Not all services are the same, but the kind of interaction is. At this level of detail, all we show is the offer and acceptance loop between the two agents and how it also applies to services. One party is a source, and the other party is a receiver of something that we call the service. There are other issues too, like making a trade or payment for the service rendered and so on, but we'll omit these in the introduction. Effectively, our services are provided freely. Let's look at a more detailed example. This could represent the service interaction at a fast food restaurant, ordering something online, or hiring a consultant. No money is exchanged in this version. Let's leave that for another time or assume that it's free. First, let's suppose the interaction starts with the provider publishing an advertisement of what it's willing to promise. This is like half a contract proposal. It acts as an invitation. Look what I can do. It's not imposing anything on another agent. It could be published in a newspaper or on a board outside the premises for passers-by to see. This is what we mean by a menu, because it's a list of offers or service types that could be served up by the provider. But it doesn't have to be food. It could be ways to fix your bathroom, a green or a blue-colored Ford, or a list of options in computer software. Second, a client shows interest by accepting and reading the menu. This is also freely done. It's a promise to absorb the information. And then, in the second line, the client may then go on to make a selection, a request from the menu, conditionally on what's printed in the menu, if you like. Notice the vertical bar, which means depends on. A request is interesting because it isn't so much a promise as an imposition. This is the first time one agent actually expects something of the other on demand, immediately, or within some time frame. Notice the block arrow, meant to look like a fist. That's how we sketch impositions, if you recall from slide 13. Also notice the bar again, meaning the request is conditional on the promises offered in the menu. This indicates that the client has absorbed the promises on the menu and builds its own intentions upon that. Third, now the provider of the menu may promise to accept this imposition if it's able and willing. And fourth, in turn, it promises to perform a service dependent on the request. This is another conditional promise. Notice how the conditional promises are written as what's promised with a vertical bar followed by what's assumed. Once the service is offered, the client can promise to accept it, and the service relationship is complete. There might be some more steps in this kind of protocol, especially those involving money, for instance. But this is a simple model that reveals a protocol that agents can use to get to know one another and avoid the appearance of imposition. We started with the provider inviting the client, but the roles could be reversed too. Sometimes the client goes first and publishes the promise of a job it needs done. It might be advertised in the paper again, desperately seeking Susan, or have you seen my cat, wanted, used car, and so on. Potential providers may then impose their offers of service back onto the client, hoping they'll accept. There's one particular mode of service which is often called out as being particularly efficient and client-friendly. That's what we call self-service. Why is self-service efficient? Promise theory points out the obvious reason, but also the trade-offs that it incurs. As examples, we might consider a typical supermarket as an example of self-service, with, say, a restaurant, which is a service on demand. A fast food place might be something in between these. The key difference in self-service is that the outcome is finished in advance of the client's interaction, in advance of the client's selection from the available menu. No imposition is required because there are no surprises. In fact, the menu in self-service is effectively the finished products themselves, like placing goods on a shelf or food in a buffet. All the client has to do is accept them by helping itself. There's no delivery delay. If self-service is so good, why don't providers always use it? This narrative has become common in cloud services, for instance. Investing in a potential sale is risky for the provider because it needs to invest up front in the full cost, even though the effort and cost could be wasted. So self-service is usually only offered for commodities, i.e., promises that are likely to be accepted by a large number of clients. If one client doesn't accept, then another will, with a high degree of certainty and less risk. Clearly there are more issues to services than this simple look, but we start to see how we can represent the issues in terms of intentional steps, using promises and impositions. And this helps us to measure or size up situations in a clear and impartial language. We can summarize services by looking at the flow. Notice that the arrows on this page are not promises, but just transitions like in a flow diagram showing the order of how the process unfolds. Service on demand starts with an offer by the provider. The client makes a request based on that offer. A service is then provided based on the request, and finally the service is accepted. By contrast, self-service begins with a service already provided based on the fixed offer, and then the service is simply accepted. At this level of representation, we see the main difference between service on demand and self-service. We can also see why self-service seems simpler and more convenient. There are fewer risk-averting obstacles or hoops to jump through for clients, and no delays. What isn't represented here, of course, is the risk to the agents. We have to remember that no promises are guarantees, not from the server side and not from the client side. Having ordered an expensive meal, a client could walk out without accepting. Similarly, having prepared a self-service buffet, buyers might simply stay away. Should buyers pay up front, promise half now, half later, or on a tab at the end? These are also issues we could try to add using more detailed promise interactions, but we'll leave these for a more advanced session.